Good afternoon and welcome to this Transport Focus production as we broadcast live our 2016 Tram Passenger Survey results. This is the fourth annual Tram Passenger Survey that we've published. And this is the first time though that we've actually done a live web broadcast. It's all very exciting, all very nervous. Hopefully technology will work this time and that we get everything across to you clearly. Lots of data, lots of information to go through. We're going to try and keep it reasonably informal and reasonably chatty. I'll come to some house rules later about how you can possibly engage with today's presentation. What's important to say is first of all, thank you for your time to Transport Focus colleagues and for those from across the tram industry, operators, transport authorities, other key stakeholders for finding the time today to tune in. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is thank you for your ongoing support of the Tram Passenger Survey. As I mentioned, it's our fourth annual publication, and we couldn't do it without you, basically, both in terms of your cooperation to make sure the field work happens on the day, as well as the financial support in terms of boosting the money that Transport Focus puts into the survey to get that deeper, richer picture of what passengers experience on a day-to-day basis on their tram journey. So I'll come to some of the house rules in a second, but please bear with us today. It's a new thing for us. Hopefully everything will go well. What's very important at the end of this production, towards the end of this week actually, we'll send you a questionnaire to give us some feedback about how it's gone for you, what's worked, what hasn't worked. If it's gone swimmingly well, my name is David Sidebottom. If it's gone terribly badly, my name is Anthony Smith, Chief Executive. So on to the house rules, I think, without any further ado. We've decided on this particular broadcast to mute the mics, so any questions that you want to put across to us, either at the end of the presentation or during the course of the presentation, we will do through the keyboard. And Stephen Harry, who's in the room, will be managing and collating these for us throughout. Use the chat function. Hopefully you can see the button there on the slide to submit your questions and comments to Steve, and he'll then give us a quick nod to make sure that we're aware of the questions coming through. What I would say is that we've got some time allotted at the end of Robert's presentation to go through questions. If you've got any really key questions or statements you want to make, then please make them and we'll do our best to fit it in and around the presentation. So that's the housekeeping stuff out of the way. At the end of today's broadcast, we'll upload a copy of a video of this onto our website alongside our PDF report and also our company press release, all of which was the embargo was lifted at 12 noon today. Some of you have already seen the annual report, and I sent it to some of you yesterday in advance, just so that you're sort of lined up for your press and media comments. So hopefully we can bring a bit more life to it today with this presentation. So any further ado, I'll hand on to Robert. Robert's our guru when it comes to Tram Passenger Survey. He's managed this project now for a couple of years, put some innovation into it, and works very closely with other bits of the organisation to make sure that it's a fit for use product, which we know it is. You keep buying more of it, which is great. And I'll hand over now to Robert so we can go through the headline results.
Great, thank you, David. So, without further ado, I thought it'd be quite useful to start off with a bit of background to the latest survey that took place in autumn last year. So, why do we do the Tram Passenger Survey? Well, it provides a consistent, robust measurement of passenger satisfaction with tram services, and it's in Britain. It's across 6 networks, services in Manchester, Birmingham, Blackpool, Edinburgh, Nottingham, and Sheffield. I said Birmingham and Wolverhampton, yes. Really, to be correct about that. And really, we do it because it informs our understanding of potentially barriers to greater use of tram, how we can encourage that, and what we can do to improve the passenger experience, which is really what we're all about. But it does allow also for comparisons to be made with other passenger experiences on, for example, buses and trains, and we'll show some of those figures towards the end of the presentation.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So how do we do the survey? It's an on-tram approach, like a bus passenger service is on bus. So passengers are approached when they're making their journey. We have interviewers on board, and they're answering the questions primarily about that specific journey that they're on. So it's a journey-based experience. They get a questionnaire to fill in, self-completion, either on paper, which a lot of people do still, or they can fill it in online. And survey takes place. We do the work that happens between 6 AM and 10 PM, and it was late September into early December last year, and we had just shy of 5,400 responses across the 6 networks in total.
And I guess over the 4 years, we're approaching around about 20,000 Tram Passenger responses for those 4 surveys. So again, thank you for the contribution you make to boosting that survey. And I'm pretty sure, I'm confident in saying that this is probably now the biggest published Tram Passenger Satisfaction Survey in the world. Someone out there may challenge me on that, but I'm going to stick to that claim and put that logo on it.
Great, thanks, David. And the other thing, other than the surveying context, really the networks in context is a really important thing to remember. We're comparing across 6 different networks, but they are very different networks, whether that be in terms of complexity. So, Blackpool, we've got 1 line, 38 stops, 11 miles, compared to Manchester, we've got 7 lines, nearly 100 stops, 57 miles it's going across. There are different facilities, there are different ways of working across those, as well as service frequency and all those kind of things. And there have been different levels of investment, engineering works and other things going on in recent years, all of which will have played their part in the last 4 years of doing the survey in ways, and also that experience that passengers are having. So it's not they're all very different. Certainly when we go and talk to the networks, some of the feedback we get is to say it's quite hard to compare ourselves. How much kind of dedicated track have we got versus with street running, and how different they are. So in Blackpool, obviously it's primarily along the promenade, whereas Manchester is overlapping with junctions and with road on street.
And it's worth saying as well, looking over the 4 years we've done this survey work, each and every one of those networks is either new in Edinburgh, there are new lines, certainly Manchester and Nottingham, for example, but also investment in terms of from the basics of track renewal in places like Sheffield, to new infrastructure, new rolling stock, new ways of paying, smart ticketing. Lots has happened in those 4 years. But the key to that is, as we see on rail, is passenger dissatisfaction can rise quite dramatically if we don't get that rebuilding and investment right while people are making their day-to-day commutes and making journeys. And I think we've seen some of that in some of the results over the previous 3 years. There's a bit of it coming through in this year's result, which Rob will go through in a second. The key to this, though, is that we're approaching a relative period of stability as a nation, apparently, as well as particularly about the tram networks. It'd be interesting to see if we're able to repeat the work later this year, whether that comes through in terms of passenger satisfaction with their journey experience. So lots of change, lots of investment, all very welcome, but passengers have felt some of that pain at times. But we'll get into the detail of that a little bit later on with Robert.
Great, thanks, David. And perhaps in a way to illustrate how different the networks are, I mentioned earlier, a minute ago, the Blackpool versus Manchester differences. So we can show that visually. Something we introduced in the last couple of years into the reports that we produced for each network is plotting out the passenger postcode location. So where are people physically located? So if I bring in the Blackpool picture, and I'm focusing more on the maps towards the bottom of the slide. Left-hand side, one thing you can see, we know Blackpool. We know Blackpool is a leisure destination, as well as obviously people living and working around there, and that's come through quite clearly. And in fact, we had to produce 2 maps for Blackpool. One on the left-hand side that shows you that draw of people and where they're coming from across the country. And on the right-hand side, the more detailed one, the yellow dots showing you where the tram stops are located, and then obviously the red dots, the kind of the clustering of local residents around that. Contrast that in a second now with Manchester, where you can see straight away we've got a network of lines going through that, which is the 7 different lines, the yellow dots, and then that's drawing in that scattering of passengers across the local area, and not all in the immediate vicinity, some further away from that. I mean, Manchester, you're more familiar with Manchester.
And to be able to paint in a picture of clearly people using it to get to places of work and education, which is one of the primary reasons for Metrolink, but also people are using Metrolink as a hub to get perhaps into Manchester for a social evening, going to a football match, sporting event, whatever it may be. So there's clearly a picture developing, and I guess with that analysis it allows Metrolink and Transport for Greater Manchester to do deeper analysis into route-based feedback from passengers as well, which is great. But it's just an interesting kind of heat map of how where people are travelling from to use tram systems.
Great, thanks, David. So without any further ado, we'll get straight into the headline findings, which everyone's keen to see. So something we introduced, David mentioned earlier on, some innovations. We introduced some infographics this year into the reports we produced. This one picks out our 4 key measures Bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the overall journey satisfaction. So this is across the 6 networks. We need to remember that, as we saw, Manchester is a much bigger network, so they play a big role in the overall score that we get. And we see here that overall journey satisfaction this year was 93%, compared with the figure last year, which was in grey there, which is 92%. Not a statistically significant increase, but going in the kind of the right direction. Value for money, we'll see, has remained pretty constant. Where we've seen increases in performance for punctuality and onboard journey times. And they're themes that we'll come back to quite a lot as we're going through the presentation. So that's a quick snapshot. We think it's potentially each of the networks have got their own version of this, something you might want to put in a depot or something to try and spread the news quite quickly with, in an easy and simple manner with staff through on your networks. So you all want to know how has everyone done? It's all very well going 93% overall, but what's the picture? And really, some of the key messages here are the fact that all the networks this time around are in the 90% plus level. So we're kind of 90% club. Everyone's in it this year. Yes, there are differences from one network to another, but given that you're all in that high level to start with, I think it's a success story of Tram. The highest of the lot is amazing score of 99% for Edinburgh Trams. And we've seen an increase for Midland Metro. And we talked a little bit earlier on about the challenges that have been faced potentially around things like the development work that's gone on. So for Midland Metro, last year the survey took place during a period, half of the survey took place during the time that the work was being done on the expansion into the city centre. So that had an effect on last year's scores, and relative to that, things have bounced back pretty well actually. And Sheffield Supertram, we'll have a look later at some of the detail behind that as to why that might have dipped off a little bit. On the right-hand side, you can see that kind of all networks average and how that's gone. Introduction of Edinburgh in 2014 onwards, we'll see that it's been increasing generally, and we're now up to 93%, the highest figure that we've had so far in our 4 years.
I mean, just general comment, stunning level of results across the picture. Really, anything that gets to 90% satisfaction of any mode, I think many other sectors, customer service sectors, will be very jealous of those kind of results. I think you've got to bear that in mind. 99% is just world class in terms of that response. But as always with these things, it's incumbent on me to say there are things that we get into the detail, as you can see, where what's behind that, what's driving that satisfaction. But there are some areas where, as always, there'll be improvements. And again, that's the point I made earlier about stability of networks. It'll be interesting to see as we repeat this work, how that kind of comes across in terms of passenger experience, given some other challenges, particularly around capacity and crowding, as more people come to use the tram. So it's how you are able to manage passenger expectations as more and more people come to want to use the network.
Great. You used the word "what's driving that," and that's very handy because that leads me straight into the next slide, which is how we call it the key driver analysis. This is how we look at the satisfaction with various ratings of the service and what difference they potentially can be making to the overall journey satisfaction measure. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at how we get a satisfactory journey score, so whether it's very or fairly satisfied. We take about 25 questions from across the survey, and we distill that through some statistical work into 10 themes. So, for example, timeliness is a combination of waiting time and punctuality. So it's in broad terms, it's quite similarly answered by passengers. So we get our 10 themes out of that. And how do we get to that general level of satisfaction? How do we get into that 90% plus level? And it's around timeliness is the key, is the most having the most impact there, followed quite closely by the environment and comfort on the tram, and that's a whole range of things like the temperature on the tram, seat comfort, space, getting ability to get a seat, a whole host of things that go into that. Whereas on the right-hand side, what we're looking at here is what's the difference between being very satisfied rather than just fairly satisfied, and we call it what makes a great journey. And here you see the on-tram environment comfort comes through more strongly, certainly relative to some of the other things. So compared with that, timeliness is less an issue. So if you've got the basics right a lot of the time, it comes through as other things. Those of you who've worked with this on the bus side of things will have seen similar analysis done, and you might be wondering what happens about staff. What about, on bus we talk about the impact of the bus driver. Well, obviously for tram, the interaction with staff is quite different. And it varies. Obviously, some networks have got conductors or people selling tickets. You've got others where you have no interaction with the driver. So to be consistent across the networks, there is no input for the staff side of things, which is why that obviously doesn't come through. It's not to say they don't play a role, but it's not something that we measure consistently to put into this.
Yeah. I mean, I think it will be, it looks and feels right. This, I mean, apart from the analysis, it's obvious that, in transport, passengers want a timely journey. They want to be picked up on time and dropped off on time. So that comes across as a satisfactory journey. As Robert says, what tips it into the very satisfying? Given the high levels of satisfaction, the challenge might be that you want to increase the number of people from being just fairly satisfied to very satisfied. And I think that's the thing there around those other softer measures, the on-tram environment. Some of them are quite tricky, particularly on capacity and space, but then just the environment, the cleanliness and the upkeep of the stock, the smoothness and speed of the journey. So I think there's stuff there to work through. You've all got this for your individual networks anyway. There might be one or two variations on this, and it might vary from one year to the next depending on things that you're doing. Yeah. But it's important that this sort of sits somewhere on someone's desk that you kind of remind you of what makes a good or a very good journey.
Okay. Thanks, David. So let's look at how some of those things have performed overall. So the timeliness, as I've mentioned, was two questions really going into that: the waiting time and punctuality. And both of those measures we've seen improvements in the last year. So I think that perhaps helps to explain why the overall scores has improved. Whereas when it comes to kind of getting to that great journey, they're very satisfied. Not so much change has gone on there, and we're actually seeing a slight decline in the amount of personal space, and we think that's related to issues around capacity and maybe things around peak times and things like that.
Yeah. And I think it's a classic build it and they'll come kind of approach that. As networks like Manchester, for example, have put double trams in, which is great. People are now filling them up, and it's that very healthy challenge of how to manage passengers' experience in time as more and more people want to use Metrolink. And again, that difficult thing of it's not an easy thing to do. We see it on rail. We're starting to see it now on tram as well, particularly in places like Manchester, where in the peaks, maybe in Sheffield as well, around the peaks, there's less space for passengers, which makes it not quite such a great journey, and that's a healthy challenge back to the industry from passengers.
So how are some of those key measures panning out across the networks? And we're not going to go into every single figure here, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear, but we're looking at some of the patterns here. So quite interesting to see in Manchester we were seeing improvements for value for money and also for punctuality. And I think it's paying back some of the investment that's obviously been put into the new works. Yep. Not this. The survey itself took place before the second city crossing was in place, but the other work was in place to try and help improve reliability of the service, really. Whereas Midland Metro, we've seen an uplift for their overall journey satisfaction, definitely related to the fact that we were post the works extending the service into the centre. Yep. Whereas in Sheffield, we've seen some drop off in the overall value for money. I think there's some work been going on there. Some fair changes have been in place, and we know for across our measures really that value for money isn't just about price, but certainly when fares are changed, it's quite sensitive to that. And then this idea of amount of personal space, although it's only showing through as a statistical difference in Sheffield, I think there are some. It is not just a Sheffield issue, but that's where it's particularly showing through, and I think there's potentially there is around peak periods. Yeah. So let's look at some of the opinions across the journey. This is just really perhaps providing that 4-year trend picture on our key measures. So great to see that value for money over the last 4 years has increased from satisfaction from 60% up to 69%, consistent between last year and this year. And then the punctuality is another area that we've really seen quite an improvement in the last few years. And certainly these overall scores are heavily driven by what's been going on in Manchester.
Yes, yeah, and that value for money score, and as Robert said earlier, it's that sort of almost a proxy for how passengers feel about their journey generally. Kind of wraps things up around cost, convenience, and the quality sort of measure. And 69% is still a very good score, don't get me wrong. It'll be interesting to see that having levelled out the previous 2 years now, whether that's as good as it gets or whether there's other things that we can do through fair deals, through enhancements to services that will kind of push that value for money rating up. But as always, the devil's in the detail, and we can delve into value for money by looking at different passenger types, for example.
Which we'll do in a minute.
Right.
So looking at overall satisfaction, providing the kind of more detailed numbers around that for each of the networks overall and in the last few years as well. And really that just kind of summarises the difference. I think the Midland Metro, looking at that, looking a little bit more detail around that, we saw last year that dropped off considerably.
Yes.
But there was kind of two stories to that, or one story with two scores in a way. We looked at the measures, last year's report we looked at Midland Metro pre and during the works, and I think last year the overall satisfaction prior to the works being taking place was about 85%, and it dropped down to something like 73%, which averaged out at 81. So we've seen an improvement on the average for last year, but we've actually also seen an improvement relative to the pre-works score we had. So we know there's a lot of new people being drawn to Midland Metro now that it's going right into the centre of Birmingham. So they've got growth in passenger numbers, and it looks as though there's pretty good satisfaction amongst those as well. Whereas we saw in Supertram, we had a great score for them last year, and one of the things we know in Supertram that they've had a lot of work in renewal work around tracks, and one of the things there that's been going is trying to recover some of the lost passenger volumes that happened at that time, and potentially some of those maybe are coming back in now, and that then also then creates new concerns and new challenges around managing capacity again.
I think one thing that stands out to me particularly is there's no network there that's got less than 50% of passengers that are very satisfied. Again, that's a stunning figure, and again, the challenge will be, you'd expect me to say, is get more people into that very satisfied darker green box, and we'll see whether that's achievable over the course of the next year or two.
If we take it some slightly different passenger groups, if we look here by gender and by age, we can see in gender terms there's not a lot of difference between them. Age-wise, we know full well that the younger passengers tend to be harder to please, more demanding, or again the experience that they're having might be different in terms of when they're travelling across the modes that we look at. We generally find that they're quite a lot lower scoring. Yes. In contrast, actually, here for Tram, we see that although they do score slightly lower, they're nowhere near the kind of level of difference that we're used to seeing.
It's worth saying as well that for younger passengers, we've
okay, I think we're getting the sound is back on. Are we visual?
Yeah, we've got thumbs up.
You can see us as well. Yeah. So we'll keep going for a second. Yeah. It might be that is it visual that we need to re-establish. Okay. Oh right. Okay. So you can hear us at the moment, but you can't quite see us.
It's probably
it's coming back on. I think we're back.
Yes, we're back. Yes, there we go.
So David, I think we will retract slightly. Differences by age and gender. Age was the thing we were talking about.
Younger passengers, harder bunch of people to please in life generally, never mind just transport. And I think I've just basically reiterating, we've just completed a fascinating study with 14 to 19-year-olds on bus. What's important to them, the differences that they see as young people taking sort of big steps in life. I'm pretty sure there'll be some read across to Tram from some of their experiences. That work will be published in late summer, early autumn. We'll make sure you see that results, and of course we'll come and talk to you if you think that'd be interesting to look at how younger passengers can be more delighted with their transport needs.
Thanks, David. And the other way that we often differentiate between passengers is the kind of type of passenger in terms of whether they're a fare payer or not, and also whether they're a commuter. And here we can see that there's actually been an improvement in the satisfaction for fare payers. I mean, it's quite hard to improve for free pass holders, given that they're nearly at the 100% level. Anyway, it's the fare payers where the improvements come from. And then we know that commuters tend to be lower scoring. They're tending to get the harder experience in terms of the peak times and things like that, and they're more reliant upon the network. But even then, the score is still pretty high on that, certainly relative to other modes that we look at.
And we've got a couple of slides later on looking specific at commuters across all the modes, and again, those results are strong, and I think that will be borne out by the data you see in a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. So let's look at value for money. Obviously, we only ask this of fare payers, so that's the base we're working from. And here we can see that generally it's around 2/3 of people are satisfied. There is some dissatisfaction. We do see that, and that seems to vary quite a bit by the networks. there have been huge improvements. For Metrolink, we can see we've gone from 3-4 years ago, we're talking about 40, nearly below the 50% level of satisfaction, and now in this latest year, we're now at over 60%. So that's an incredible improvement we've seen in the last few years. Whereas we've seen a drop off super tram, certainly relative to last year, back to sort of a couple of years ago where we were at. But we do know that there have been some fare increases there. And whilst it isn't just about price, combination perhaps of that and other factors around perhaps some capacity and crowding, we'll see in a minute, maybe playing into that.
As I mentioned earlier, I think for many passengers, and I think for the conversations we've had with you as operators and authorities, that often value for money is as an important measure as the overall satisfaction, because it's a bit of a proxy for how passengers feel overall, and it's very sensitive to price. And we know in Sheffield there have been some fare adjustments, some fare increases. Metrolink, 22% of passengers actively dissatisfied in some way, shape or form with value for money. That's, we've held the mirror up, and that's what passengers are saying. And I think there's some work to be done there. As we see a bit of stability coming back into all these networks. In Manchester, the second city crossing is now in, so any work we do this autumn will be of the network as is now, with hopefully less disruption. And we'll see how that goes.
Great.
In the future. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. I think we sounds coming in and out a little bit. I think we're generally okay, so that's we'll keep rolling on that. So let's look at the differences by the age and whether commuting or non-commuting on things like value for money. And we can see there again that yes, the younger people tend to be slightly lower scoring in terms of what they think of value for money, and also the commuters. And we know that that's particularly an issue for some of the other. So certainly on other modes and things as well. Interesting to see that the improvement on value for money is really come amongst non-commuters rather than commuters. So let's look at waiting the experience. What's it like waiting at the stop? And just a few. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on this. So we've picked out the overall satisfaction with the stop, and again we're all close to or close to the 90% level. It has dropped off a little bit for Supertram relative to previous years, and we'll go into some of the detail around that in a minute. Waiting times has been a positive story this year, so we've seen improvements for satisfaction with waiting times. Expected waiting times and actual report times have been dropping, which is great. And in terms of how people check their waiting when the tram is due, about 3/4 of people are doing that. And there's a variety of sources for that. And of course, that will vary depending on what's available for each network. Those who don't check, vast majority of those, they know its service is pretty frequent, and that's obviously an advantage when you're providing a frequent service. It's more about service interval rather than specific times. Looking across the different networks on these measures with the stop. We're repeating there obviously what we saw before, that the overall satisfaction dropped off slightly for Supertram. What's behind that? Well, there's some things around the convenience or the accessibility where the stop is, but actually harder to control. But there is something coming through in terms of the maintenance and general condition, something that's also come through for Blackpool as we saw there, both in terms of that and also in terms of sort of graffiti and vandalism, that sort of maintenance of the stops.
I think overall, there's been a lot of expansion, particularly in places like Manchester and Nottingham. The new line in Edinburgh, it's just keeping it feeling as though it's fresh and new still. Clearly, it's a challenge. Lots of these stops are at obviously street level and in very close to housing conurbations. So it's a challenge, but keeping it fresh, keeping it looking new is a challenge. But passengers notice it when it is.
And I think certainly from relative to some of the other, certainly relative to bus, there's a much more consistent experience for passengers in terms of a stop. So picking out a couple of things from that, the satisfaction with waiting time, we saw that that had improved, and the actual waiting time. So across all the networks, we've dropped to about just over 5.5 minutes on average actual waiting time. Satisfaction with that increasing to getting close towards the 90% level. And we see across the networks that certainly Metrolink and Midland Metro, both of those, we've seen reductions in the actual amount of time waited. That's fed through in Manchester to an improvement in the satisfaction with waiting time. Hasn't quite had the same effect yet in the Midlands.
And that's all very important in terms of going back a few slides. We talk about drive satisfaction. Anything that sort of manages passengers' expectation about the waiting time, the time on the journey, just making that feel that they're more in control, I think, will filter through in terms of better satisfaction overall.
And certainly the more recent work, obviously we know there's been expansion of lines for Manchester, but the more recent work has been a bit more around the idea of bringing in some more stability and reliability to the system. Not all in yet, because the second city crossing wasn't in place. But that seems to be feeding through in terms of it's gone from 76% 3-4 years ago up to 85% satisfaction with that waiting time now, which is great. It's a double-edged sword though, because the more you tell people about, it's partly about information. So if you're telling people about when they're clear information about when the tram's due, you kind of need to deliver on it. You almost raise expectations. So again, talk about raising expectations. How did that waiting time compare to what was expected? We've also got in here the reported times, and again versus the expectation. In most cases, people is either around what they expected or it's more. But there are some pockets, obviously, for quite a few people where that waiting time is little or much longer. And whether that's related to information provision or actual delay is always slightly harder to pick out. So onboard experience, what's it like on the tram? A few key measures. So firstly off, the start of the journey, about the information, exterior cleanliness, all those, nothing much has changed around here. They're all very high scoring. When we get to the onboard situation, this is where some of the stresses of the system are coming through a bit more. That personal space score dropping down. Other things haven't necessarily changed dramatically. We will see there in terms of some measures on the driver, which are some of those are less consistent across the networks. We don't necessarily measure them on all of them, whereas obviously safety we do. I'm sure obviously you can't help but see that there's been a slight drop off in that, in the safety of the driving. It's still a very high score. We've done some separate analysis to see whether the Croydon incident had any impact on the way that people were rating that. There's no conclusion of any conclusion around a specific impact that was had. But we've done the analysis, and it's in some of the more detailed slides.
There's nothing there to sort of say that maybe the news may have affected passengers' perception of safety of driving, and there's nothing from the results we've seen pre and post the sad incident in Croydon that's driven that particular result.
So really, that kind of brings us on that's the kind of major picture. So what might have gone wrong? What might be a negative experience on the journey? So a delay, that's a pretty clear negative experience that you might have had. And we see across the networks as a whole, 1 in 12 roughly of passengers saying that they experienced a delay to their journey. That varies quite a lot across the networks. You can't ignore that. But has been less of a factor for Manchester and Midland Metro this time around. But more so for Sheffield, and that delay to journey in people's minds. We don't kind of talk about it in absolute minutes or how is it. It could be that your journey's delayed because there are engineering works, slightly meaning you have to take slight alternatives. So that could certainly in terms of Midland Metro last year. So improvement relative to that. Those delays periods are not necessarily the same. Some of them, so there's very few delays in Blackpool, but where they were, the average perceived delay was quite long. And it does vary, whereas in Sheffield, where we've got more people, but it's not necessarily such a long time. The common causes do vary. The numbers for this are quite small in some cases, but so we saw in Sheffield where it's people talking about waiting too long at stops, so service management, interval management, potentially things like that, or congestion. And congestion is certainly a factor on the bus side of things. We've seen that a lot. But of course, the nature of the dedicated running versus parallel running or crossing road jumps will obviously impact on things like this. And then finally, at the bottom, we've got the extent to which people felt concerned about the behaviour of other passengers on board, the kind of antisocial behaviour. And those are, again, varying levels across the networks. We know the networks always are really interested in this. I'm really keen to try and keep that, reduce it or keep it to an absolute minimum level. But in the majority of cases, it's things like rowdy behaviour rather than more serious incidents.
And I mean, clearly, Manchester from that result there, so 1 in 10 journeys, but there have been 1 or 2 high-profile local and national news coverage of incidents on Manchester Metro in the last year. But as Robert said, it's the lower level stuff, it's the rowdy stuff. And I think one thing that Metrolink is doing, and we'll see with the new award as well, is perhaps more visible staff, whether that's around revenue protection stuff or just people having staff in and around stops and stations, just to make sure that it not just offers the general advice and information and assistance that people might want, but also just kind of reassures people about feelings of personal security and safety. And we've been interested to sort of track that over the course of the next year or two in terms of greater staff visibility, whether that translates through into improved results in those particular areas.
So what do we think they might have come up with? What do we think suggestions might have come from passengers? I mean, normally at this point it shouldn't be any major surprises given what we've seen elsewhere. Now, given that the levels are very high of satisfaction, it's not surprising that almost 2/3 of passengers didn't have any suggestions, no suggestions or improvements. Of the third that did, the most common ones are around things like the design and comfort condition of the tram. That can be a whole host of things, whether it's cleanliness, whether it's seats comfort. We can see seats come through in the word cloud there as a key thing, but that could also be related to seating in terms of getting a seat and seating and capacity, and those are probably the two key ones. And certainly we'll always get comments potentially around tickets and fares and costs and things like that. But certainly from what we've seen elsewhere, we know that those are the kind of issues, and they vary from one network to another, which is the biggest, which is the most prominent. So that's kind of a wrap up of the individual journey. What we also look at are some slightly more general ones to get an idea of that more gut feel of what's the general perception, how are people feeling about trams, the tram services locally, and here we've got a range of measures on this. Not a lot of change has gone on. It's good to see that some things have been improving over the last 4 years. So punctuality has been improving. It's gone from 75% up to 83%. And this is a general perception. This isn't just about that one journey. Likewise, frequency has seen improvements too. And I think one of the points I want to draw out from this is the fact that those scores are all still very high.
Yes.
We know on other modes, so particularly on bus, you're getting into the kind of 60% levels for some of these more general things, whereas for tram it's remaining high, which suggests to us in a way that there's a more consistent provision of service.
And I think it reflects, obviously, your tram network is local, it's built by the city for the city to get people to jobs, leisure, education, and those bottom two factors there about easy getting to local amenities and connections with the modes are key in an integrated transport network. And if you're getting towards 9 out of 10 passengers offering a view there that it's great, and clearly people are using it because it's doing what it wanted to do. It's getting them to places they want to go to easily and conveniently. And I think obviously the flip side of that is that there's 13% of people that it's not quite fulfilling that. Equally, there are people who are not using tram or bus because it doesn't take them to where they want to go. That's a different question, different piece of research. But for a local politician, it's interesting that in those areas. The network that's built by the city for the city is delivering largely for users.
Great. So we picked out one of those, the idea of frequency of service, the general frequency of service, so how often the trams run, and that's where we've seen great improvements, and we've particularly seen it for Manchester, so that's gone up from 66% 4 years ago now to 80%, and potentially with the introduction of the second city crossing, that may well improve further. Whereas the one drop-off we've seen there is for Supertram, although it was a particularly good score last year, but it has dropped down relative to that. And whether that's bunching of trams or other things, particularly around peak times, I think peak time is maybe the issue there. So to summarise, really, across the 6 networks, we've seen that satisfaction has got to our highest level now, 93%. It's high across all the networks. We're all in the 90% club now.
Very good.
But we did see a slight drop in ratings in Sheffield. Edinburgh, top of the pile, although we don't like to talk about league tables, but they are the top, our highest one, and they're almost perfect score, 99%. Midland Metro, the work that went on extending into the city centre last year did cause a sharp drop-off in 2015, so there was severe disruption for people. Recovery this time is welcome, so that's great to see. The challenge for Midland Metro will be the new lot of work that's going on at the moment in terms of track renewal.
Yes.
We saw from the square pies earlier, as we like to call them, the key factor is around making it satisfactory, is around timeliness, the core deliverables, and punctuality and wait times both improved. Whereas for getting to that great experience, there's a whole range of things around the on-board experience. And the challenge in a way there is what we see around things like personal space, and also for Nottingham. Other improvements mentioned things around seating capacity on board, Metrolink, and we know again the challenge there is the increase in passenger volumes. You've got to meet it with somehow with capacity, and also a bit around fares and tickets for Edinburgh. Relatively few people who are experiencing a delay are also being troubled by the behaviour of others, and as mentioned earlier on, it's the rowdy behaviour side of things for that rather than anything some of the more serious things. And then, as we just saw, looking at things more generally, passengers are generally satisfied, pretty high levels, but slightly lower level compared to the journeys. There's always improvements to make, so that every journey is a great journey. I think that's kind of
I think there's just 2 quick points for me. One is particularly this issue about the previous 4 years and the last 12 months, where there's been a lot of investment in infrastructure. Commuters see that day in, day out, and clearly for some passengers there's some levels of dissatisfaction. But at the same time, we can see some of the results coming through now about where the network is restored in the Midlands particularly, and we look forward to hopefully seeing those results in Greater Manchester with the second city crossing now open, as the network is now finally sort of integrated and running fully.
And really all that leaves us to do is to actually wrap up some of these differences by mode. So here we are comparing the bus, train and tram, so bus passenger survey, National Rail Passenger Survey and Tram Passenger Survey, and we've seen, as we've seen before, trams continue to outperform both train and buses on the overall scores, and across most of the measures. The only couple of exceptions to that are around information provision at stops versus rail, and availability of seating or space to stand versus bus, and we know that's certainly a bigger issue for on the rail side of things. But that's the general picture. You could argue that people are using rail, tram, bus are a bit different, but what's more consistent is the commuters. So let's look at the experience for commuters, and there's actually quite a similar pattern. Trains are outperforming both tram.
A very stark picture then in terms of value for money. It's a very well publicised issue on rail. Very poor rating of value for money amongst rail commuters, particularly London and the South East, though not exclusively. That's it's other parts of the country. They really are getting the sort of mucky end of the stick at times in terms of consistent delivery of services, and we've seen various, whether it be strike action, whether it be delays, engineering works, whatever's caused that on rail, but a much healthier picture for bus and tram passengers when it comes to value for money. Still some room for improvement, I'm sure everyone will agree, but going in the right direction. And we're very confident that across these 3 bits of research that we run, it's a very similar picture. It's done at roughly the same time. Bus passenger survey covers about 50,000 passenger experiences, views every autumn. Rail, about 25,000 passengers in the autumn wave of work, and of course tram, as we know from the work we've just been talking about over the last 40 minutes or so.
And what's highlighted on the slide there are where there are the biggest differences between the passengers as a whole and commuters. So for bus, it's around punctuality. For rail, it's around value for money, as David's already mentioned, punctuality, things like helpfulness of staff, and the seating and space to stand. And that's the other one for tram. It's about idea of capacity in a way, is the thing where the commuters are perhaps having a harder time.
Excellent. Well, I understand there are no questions coming through, so clearly we've boxed off all the
brilliant.
All the things. So well done, Robert, and, for doing that. I just want to sort of thank, just very quickly, you for dialing in today, giving up your busy time. I just want to say a couple of bits of next steps. Hopefully recording this will be appearing on our website in the not too distant future. We'll send you a questionnaire so you can rate our performance in terms of how we've done. It's very important that we understand how our first web broadcast has gone, so we can tweak and refine it for any second ones. Perhaps more importantly as well is just to say that yesterday the Transport Focus Board approved the Transport Focus contribution for the 2017 Tram Passenger Survey, so we're putting a slug of money in to repeating the work, which inevitably means we'll come knocking on your doors again to seek your contribution to give that deeper, richer picture of the passenger experience, to make it even more useful. We want to make it bigger and better every year, so that's our challenge back to you in terms of our conversations coming up. And finally, also to say that in a parallel piece of work, we'll be coming to talk to you about a longer-term strategy for the Tram Passenger Survey. Some of that is about money, some of it's about methodology, some of it's about the frequency of the work. We want to make this useful, a useful consumer tool for driving improvements for passengers. We're going to do that by talking to you. So thank you again for your time today. Thank you to colleagues for making this all work, Robert for all his work, and Stephen for the production today, and other colleagues who have made, Elizabeth who has made the work getting the invitations wrapped up today, and other colleagues like Linda McCord, Robert Sampson and David Beer, who have taken the results out to you locally as networks to discuss it. So thank you to them. And thank you again for your time, and it's good night from me and good night from him. Thank you very much.
Thank you.